In 1953, South Korea was the poorest country on earth. Not one of the poorest. The poorest? The average income was $67 per year. That's less than Ghana, less than the Philippines, less than most of sub-Saharan Africa. North Korea was actually richer than South Korea at the time. The country had just been destroyed by 3 years of war. Every major city was in ruins. There was no infrastructure, no factories, no electricity in most areas, no running water. Most people lived in absolute poverty, barely surviving. And here's the crazy part. Korea had been colonized by Japan for 35 years before the war. Japan had extracted all of Korea's resources and left nothing behind. Then the country got split in half and fought a devastating civil war. South Korea had no natural resources, no oil, no gold, no minerals worth mining. They couldn't even feed their own population. They had to import food just to prevent mass starvation. International experts looked at South Korea and said, this country has no future. It will remain poor forever. There's nothing here to build an economy on. Fast forward 70 years to today. South Korea is the 10th largest economy in the world with a GDP of over $1.7 trillion. The average income is now $35,000 per year. That's a 500-fold increase in 70 years. Seoul is one of the most advanced cities on the planet with skyscrapers, high-speed internet, and technology that rivals anywhere in the world. Korean companies dominate global industries. Samsung is the world's largest smartphone maker. Hyundai is one of the top car manufacturers. LG, SK, and dozens of other Korean companies are global leaders, and Korean culture has taken over the world. K-pop groups like BTS and Blackpink sell out stadiums globally. Korean dramas are watched by hundreds of millions. Korean movies win Oscars. This is the greatest economic transformation in modern history. No country has ever gone from absolute poverty to developed nation status this fast. So how did South Korea do it? What was the strategy, and what did it cost? In this video, I'm breaking down exactly how South Korea pulled off the miracle on the Han River. Let's get into it. To understand how incredible South Korea's rise was, you need to see just how destroyed the country was in 1953. The Korean War had just ended, and South Korea was completely devastated. Over 3 million people had died. That's 10% of the entire population. Every major city had been bombed repeatedly. Seoul changed hands 4 times during the war, getting destroyed and rebuilt over and over. By 1953, there was almost nothing left. 80% of industrial facilities were destroyed. Roads, bridges, railways, all gone. The electrical grid was knocked out. Most of the country had no power. Factories that existed before the war were now piles of rubble. The agricultural sector was destroyed. Farms had been battlefields. Fields were full of landmines. Irrigation systems were bombed. Even if you wanted to grow food, it was nearly impossible. Millions of people were homeless, living in makeshift shelters or refugee camps. There was widespread malnutrition and disease. But it gets worse. Before the war, Korea had been a Japanese colony for 35 years, from 1910 to 1945. During that time, Japan had extracted all of Korea's resources and used Koreans as forced labor. Japan built some infrastructure, but only to serve Japanese interests, not to develop Korea. When Japan left, they took everything valuable with them and left Korea with nothing. And then the country got divided. North and South Korea split along the 38th parallel. All the heavy industry and natural resources were in the north. The South got agriculture, but even that was destroyed by the war. South Korea had no blueprint for development, no industries, no capital, no technology, no educated workforce. Most people were illiterate. There were only a handful of university graduates in the entire country. The country was completely dependent on foreign aid, mostly from the United States. Without American food and money, South Korea would have collapsed completely. In 1953, South Korea's GDP per capita was $67. To put that in perspective, that's lower than Haiti, lower than most African countries, lower than almost anywhere on Earth. Experts predicted South Korea would remain a poor, aid-dependent country forever. They were wrong. The transformation started with one man who took power in a military coup. In 1961, a military general named Park Chung-hee staged a coup and took control of South Korea. And this is where the story gets complicated, because Park was a dictator. He ruled with an iron fist. He suppressed political opposition. He arrested dissidents. He censored the media. He was absolutely authoritarian. But he also had a vision for South Korea's future, and he was willing to do whatever it took to make it happen. Park looked at South Korea's situation and realized they had no choice but to industrialize rapidly or stay poor forever. But how do you industrialize when you have no money, no technology, no resources, and no expertise? Park studied other countries that had successfully developed. He looked at Japan's Meiji Restoration. He studied Taiwan's development. He analyzed Germany's post-war recovery. And he came up with a plan that was bold, risky, and required massive government control over the economy. His strategy was simple in concept, but brutal in execution. First, South Korea would focus entirely on exports. They couldn't rely on domestic consumption because the population was too poor. They needed to sell products to rich countries like the United States, Japan, and Europe. Second, the government would pick specific industries to develop and pour all resources into them. Light manufacturing first, then heavy industry, then technology. Third, the government would create large corporations called Chaebols and give them massive support, loans, and protection to grow quickly. Fourth, the country would borrow heavily from foreign lenders to finance industrialization. This was risky because if it failed, South Korea would be buried in debt. And fifth, the entire population would have to work incredibly hard with low wages to make Korean products competitive globally. This wasn't capitalism. This wasn't socialism. This was state-directed capitalism where the government controlled almost everything. Park's government decided which industries to build, which companies to support, and even what products to make. And Park demanded results. If a company failed to meet export targets, government support was cut off. If workers protested for higher wages, they were suppressed. Everything was about rapid growth, no matter the cost. And it started with the most basic industries. Park Chung-hee knew South Korea couldn't build advanced industries overnight, so he started with the simplest manufacturing: textiles, clothing, and wigs. Yes, wigs. In the 1960s, South Korean women were cutting their hair and selling it to wig factories that exported to the United States and Europe. It sounds ridiculous, but it worked. South Korea had one advantage: cheap labor. Korean workers would work for far less than American or European workers. So Park's strategy was to make basic products cheaply and sell them abroad. The government provided loans to textile factories. They built industrial zones with subsidized electricity and infrastructure. They gave tax breaks to companies that exported products. And they kept wages low to maintain competitive prices. By the mid-1960s, textiles and light manufacturing made up over 70% of South Korea's exports. The country was making clothes, shoes, toys, and simple electronics. Nothing advanced, but it was generating foreign currency that South Korea desperately needed. Then Park moved to the next phase: heavy industry. In 1973, he announced the heavy and chemical industry drive. South Korea would build steel mills, shipyards, chemical plants, and car factories. But there was a problem. South Korea had no expertise in these industries. They'd never built a ship or made steel at scale before. So what did they do? They copied. Korean engineers went to Japan, Europe, and the United States to learn how these industries worked. Sometimes they were sent as students, sometimes as workers in foreign factories. They learned everything they could, came back to Korea, and replicated it. The government poured billions of dollars into building shipyards in cities like Ulsan. At first, Korean ships were low quality and cheap, but they kept improving. Within 20 years, South Korea became the world's largest shipbuilder. Same with steel. The government built POSCO, a state-owned steel company, from nothing. By the 1990s, POSCO was one of the most efficient steel producers in the world, and cars. Hyundai started making terrible cars in the 1970s. They were cheap and broke down constantly, but Hyundai kept improving. By the 2000s, Hyundai was competing with Toyota and Honda. This strategy worked because the government protected these industries. High tariffs kept foreign competition out. Cheap loans kept companies afloat even when they were losing money. And the government pushed these companies to export aggressively, giving them targets they had to meet. The Chaebols are the key to understanding South Korea's rise, and they're also the most controversial part of the story. Chaebols are massive family-owned conglomerates that dominate the Korean economy. Samsung, Hyundai, LG, SK Group, Lotte. These aren't just companies, they're empires. Samsung alone makes up 20% of South Korea's entire GDP. One company. 20% of the economy. How did this happen? Park Chung-hee's government deliberately created these giants. Instead of letting thousands of small companies compete, the government picked a handful of families and companies and gave them everything they needed to grow massive quickly. Cheap loans from state-owned banks, exclusive rights to certain industries, protection from foreign competition, access to imported technology. The deal was simple. We'll give you everything you need, but you must hit export targets and grow fast. If you succeed, you get even more support. If you fail, we'll replace you. Samsung is the perfect example. It started as a trading company selling fish and groceries. Then the government told Samsung's founder, Lee Byung-chul, that South Korea needed electronics manufacturing. Samsung had zero experience in electronics, but the government gave them loans, imported machinery, and sent engineers abroad to learn. Samsung started making simple black and white TVs in the 1970s. The quality was terrible, but they kept improving. The government kept supporting them. By the 1990s, Samsung was making semiconductors and memory chips. Today, Samsung is the world's largest maker of smartphones, TVs, and memory chips. Hyundai followed the same path. The founder, Chung Ju-young, started with a car repair shop. Then the government told him South Korea needed a car industry. Hyundai had never built a car before, but the government provided funding and protection. Hyundai licensed technology from Ford, copied Japanese designs, and started making cheap cars. They were terrible at first, but Hyundai kept improving. Today, Hyundai is one of the top 5 car companies in the world. The Chaebol model worked because these companies could achieve economies of scale quickly. Instead of having 50 small companies competing and staying small, South Korea created 5 giant companies that could compete globally. But there's a dark side. The Chaebols became too powerful. They control the economy, they control politics. The families that own them are treated like royalty. They've been involved in massive corruption scandals. Samsung's chairman was convicted of bribery and corruption multiple times, but kept getting pardoned because the government couldn't afford to hurt Samsung. The Chaebols also crushed small businesses. If you're a small Korean company and Samsung decides to enter your industry, you're finished. But despite these problems, the Chaebols were essential to South Korea's rise. While the government was building industries, they made another critical investment that many countries ignore: education. Park Chung-hee understood that South Korea's only real resource was its people. If Koreans were educated, skilled, and hardworking, the country could compete with anyone. So South Korea went all in on education in a way few countries have ever done. In the 1950s, most Koreans were illiterate. By the 1990s, South Korea had one of the highest literacy rates in the world at nearly 100%. How? The government made primary education mandatory and free. They built schools in every village and city. They trained teachers by the thousands. Parents were told that education was the only way their children would escape poverty, and they believed it. Korean families became obsessed with education. Parents would work multiple jobs just to pay for their children's schooling. Students would study 12 to 14 hours per day. The pressure was extreme, but it worked. South Korea also invested heavily in technical education. They built vocational schools to train workers for factories. They created engineering programs at universities. They sent thousands of students abroad to study at top universities in the United States, Japan, and Europe with government scholarships. But there was a catch. You had to come back. If you studied abroad on a government scholarship, you were required to return to South Korea and work for the country's development. This prevented brain drain and ensured that Korea's best and brightest stayed home. By the 1980s, South Korea was producing world-class engineers, scientists, and managers. These people went to work at Samsung, Hyundai, and other Chaebols, constantly improving products and processes. The education system also created a culture of discipline and hard work. Korean students learned that success required sacrifice, sleep less, study more, work harder than everyone else. This mindset carried over into the workforce, but the education system had costs. The pressure on students is intense. South Korea has one of the highest youth suicide rates in the world. Students spend their entire childhood preparing for a single college entrance exam that determines their future. The competition is brutal. Many students attend Hagwons, which are private after-school academies, until midnight just to keep up. It's not sustainable or healthy, but it created a generation of highly educated workers who powered South Korea's transformation from manufacturing to high-tech industries. Education turned South Korea from a country of farmers into a country of engineers. And that made all the difference. South Korea's economic miracle wasn't free. It came with enormous human costs that are often ignored when people celebrate the success story. Let's talk about what South Koreans actually sacrificed to make this transformation happen. First, political freedom. Park Chung-hee was a dictator. There were no free elections, no freedom of speech, no freedom of the press. If you criticized the government, you were arrested. Student protesters were beaten or killed. Opposition politicians were jailed. Park ruled South Korea like a military state because he believed democracy would slow down development. He wasn't completely wrong. Democratic countries have to negotiate with different interest groups, deal with protests, and compromise. Park didn't have to do any of that. He just ordered what he wanted, and it happened. But this meant an entire generation of Koreans lived without political rights. Second, worker exploitation. South Korean workers in the 1960s and 1970s worked some of the longest hours in the world for extremely low wages. Factory workers would work 12 to 14-hour shifts, 6 or 7 days a week. Conditions were dangerous. Labor unions were banned or crushed by the government. If workers tried to strike for better conditions, they were arrested or fired. Women especially were exploited in textile factories. They worked in terrible conditions for wages that barely covered survival. But the government and Chaebols argued this was necessary. Low wages kept Korean products cheap and competitive globally. If wages went up, South Korea would lose its competitive advantage. Third, environmental destruction. South Korea industrialized so fast that they completely ignored environmental protection. Factories dumped waste into rivers. Air pollution in Seoul became some of the worst in the world. Entire ecosystems were destroyed to build industrial zones. The government didn't care because growth was the only priority. Fourth, social pressure and mental health. The education system and work culture created immense psychological pressure. Students were told their entire future depended on test scores. Workers were told to sacrifice everything for the company. The concept of work-life balance didn't exist. Even today, South Korea has one of the highest suicide rates in the developed world, and one of the lowest birth rates because people are exhausted and can't imagine raising children in such a competitive society. And fifth, inequality. While the Chaebols and their owners became incredibly wealthy, ordinary Koreans struggled. The wealth gap grew massively. A small elite controlled most of the economy, while workers lived paycheck to paycheck. So yes, South Korea became rich, but it came at a cost that many Koreans are still paying today. Just when South Korea seemed unstoppable, everything almost collapsed. In 1997, the Asian financial crisis hit, and South Korea was on the verge of total economic meltdown. Here's what happened. Throughout the 1990s, South Korean companies had borrowed massive amounts of money from foreign banks. The Chaebols were expanding aggressively, building factories, buying companies, and investing in risky projects. They borrowed in US dollars, assuming the Korean won would stay stable, but they were over-leveraged, and many of their investments weren't profitable. Then, in 1997, the Thai currency collapsed, triggering a chain reaction across Asia. Foreign investors panicked and started pulling money out of Asian countries. South Korea was hit hard. Foreign banks demanded their loans be paid back immediately. But South Korean companies didn't have the cash. They'd invested everything in long-term projects. The Korean won collapsed. It lost 50% of its value in weeks. This made all the dollar-denominated debt twice as expensive to pay back. Companies started going bankrupt. Even major Chaebols were failing. Kia Motors collapsed. Daewoo, one of the largest Chaebols, went under. Banks were failing because their loans weren't being repaid. Unemployment skyrocketed. People who had secure jobs their entire lives were suddenly laid off. The stock market crashed. The country was running out of foreign currency reserves. South Korea was days away from defaulting on its debt, which would have been catastrophic. So the government did something humiliating. They went to the International Monetary Fund and begged for a bailout. The IMF agreed to lend South Korea $58 billion, but with strict conditions. South Korea had to restructure its economy, open up to foreign investment, let failing companies go bankrupt instead of bailing them out, cut government spending, raise interest rates, and allow the currency to float freely. It was painful. Thousands of companies went bankrupt. Unemployment hit 7%, which doesn't sound high, but in a country that had near full employment for decades, it was devastating. Middle-class families lost everything. But here's where South Korea showed its resilience. The entire country rallied together. There was a national campaign where citizens donated their personal gold jewelry and savings to help pay off the national debt. Housewives brought their wedding rings. Families donated gold heirlooms. Over 3.5 million people participated, collecting 227 tons of gold worth billions of dollars. This actually helped. But more importantly, South Korea used the crisis to restructure. They forced the Chaebols to become more efficient. They closed down unprofitable divisions. They modernized the financial system. They opened up to foreign investment. And within 2 years, South Korea had fully recovered and paid back the IMF loan early. The crisis that nearly destroyed South Korea actually made it stronger. After recovering from the 1997 crisis, South Korea didn't just rebuild. They transformed into a global cultural and technological superpower that nobody saw coming. Let's start with technology. Samsung went from making cheap electronics to becoming the world's most valuable tech company. They invested billions in research and development. Today, Samsung makes the best smartphone displays, memory chips, and semiconductors in the world. They compete directly with Apple and often win. LG became a leader in displays, batteries, and home appliances. SK Group dominates semiconductors and telecommunications. South Korean companies control massive portions of global supply chains. If you own a smartphone, TV, or computer, there's a very good chance it has South Korean components inside. But the most unexpected transformation was cultural. In the early 2000s, the South Korean government made a strategic decision. They would invest in cultural exports, music, movies, TV shows, video games. They called it the Korean Wave, or Hallyu. The government provided funding for entertainment companies. They built state-of-the-art studios. They trained performers. They helped Korean companies expand globally, and it worked beyond anyone's wildest expectations. K-pop exploded globally. BTS became one of the biggest music acts in the world, selling out stadiums in America, Europe, and everywhere. Blackpink, Twice, Stray Kids, and dozens of other groups have millions of fans worldwide. Korean dramas became global phenomena. Shows like Squid Game, Crash Landing on You, and Kingdom are watched by hundreds of millions on Netflix. Korean movies started winning Oscars. Parasite won Best Picture in 2020, the first foreign language film ever to do so. Korean video games dominate esports. League of Legends, created by Riot Games with Korean influence, is one of the biggest games in the world. Korean beauty products, Korean food, Korean fashion. Everything Korean became trendy globally. This cultural power translates into real economic value. The Korean wave generates billions in revenue and makes global consumers more likely to buy Korean products. If you love BTS, you're more likely to buy a Samsung phone. South Korea also became a leader in internet infrastructure. They have the fastest internet speeds in the world. Nearly 100% of households have high-speed internet. This allowed Korean companies to develop advanced digital services. Today, South Korea's GDP per capita is over $35,000. They're the 10th largest economy in the world. They went from receiving foreign aid to giving foreign aid, from borrowing technology to creating it, from being colonized to being a cultural colonizer. In just 70 years, South Korea went from the poorest country on earth to a nation that the world looks up to, learns from, and wants to emulate. So what can we learn from South Korea's transformation? Let's be clear about what worked and what it cost. First, South Korea succeeded because they had a clear strategy and executed it relentlessly. They didn't try to do everything at once. They started with simple manufacturing, then moved to heavy industry, then to high tech, then to cultural exports. Each phase built on the previous one. Most developing countries jump around without a coherent plan. South Korea had a roadmap and stuck to it for decades. Second, education was the foundation of everything. South Korea invested in its people when they had almost no money. They understood that human capital matters more than natural resources. A country with smart, skilled, disciplined workers can compete with anyone. Third, the export-led model worked. South Korea couldn't rely on domestic consumption because the population was too poor. So they made products for rich countries and earned foreign currency to reinvest in development. Fourth, government direction mattered. Yes, South Korea used market forces, but the government actively shaped which industries developed and how. This isn't pure free market capitalism, and it's not socialism. It's state-directed development. Whether this model can work in democracies is debatable, but it worked in South Korea's specific context. But let's also be honest about the costs. South Korea sacrificed political freedom for decades. Workers were exploited. The environment was destroyed. Social pressure and mental health problems are still major issues today. Income inequality remains high. The Chaebols have too much power and resist reform. And South Korea's model required specific conditions that may not exist elsewhere. They had U.S. military and economic support during the Cold War. They had access to Japanese technology in American markets. They had a homogeneous population that could be mobilized around national goals. They had leaders willing to make ruthless decisions without democratic accountability. Could another country replicate this? Maybe, but it would require similar conditions, similar sacrifices, and similar political will. What's undeniable is the result. In 1953, South Korea's GDP per capita was $67. Today, it's $35,000. That's a 522-fold increase in 70 years. No country in history has risen this fast from absolute poverty to developed nation status. South Korea proved that geography isn't destiny. Natural resources don't determine success. With the right strategy, education, and execution, any country can transform itself. But transformation requires sacrifice, and not everyone is willing to pay that price. If you want to see another incredible transformation story, check out my video on how Singapore went from being kicked out of Malaysia to becoming 5 times richer. The link is in the description. If you found this valuable, hit the like button and subscribe, because we're breaking down more economic transformations every week. See you in the next one.